Often it's someone who has only been at scale for most of their career. If you weren't early stage at these companies, it's going to be a big challenge because the challenges that you face in these larger scale companies aren't going to be the same challenges.
Some people feel quite frustrated because they sort of say, I know I can do this role. The practical, clear-eyed advice is companies can often be very risk adverse in their hiring. They want candidates who have solved the challenges that they're facing in some way or form.
Welcome everyone back to the Executive Edge podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I am your co-host and the co-founder of Mission One, Dan Hampton. I am based in Miami, and we have Gerard Miles based in London. On our last episode, we covered interviewing and top tips. Today, we're going to start a 3-part series on how to navigate the executive job search. We're going to cover part 1, prep for the job search. So today we're going to talk about strategy and tactics, building your ecosystem and what that means, expectations, and some things to think about from the start. The next episode, part 2, we'll cover your approach to the job search. We'll talk about how to get visibility into roles of a mostly hidden job market. We'll talk about importance of the LinkedIn profile versus the resume, additionally the strategy around networking, and the best approach to outreach. Part 3, we'll cover the role of the executive recruiter in this process. We'll talk about the different types of headhunters and firms, how they can help you and vice versa, and the best way to engage and communicate with these firms or specific recruiters. Let's dig into kind of who this podcast will be most relevant for. Again, the prep for the search. Gerard, do you want to cover that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan. And I think focusing on today then, so we're going to be focusing on how do you prep for that job search? You're looking for an executive top role and you want to navigate that. So I think the people that this could be relevant for, or the conversations we have with candidates regularly, either the people who are reactively looking for a role, maybe something's happened at their current company, it hasn't gone quite the way they want. Clearly, we've seen a lot of change, particularly in the sort of post-pandemic era that we're still in, where there's a lot of churn and change in roles and titles and requirements. Or again, it could be there's a more proactive individual who's thinking, okay, well, I'm in an okay spot here, but I'm really hankering for that next role, that next promotion, whatever it is, and for whatever reasons it's not available, in their current organization, or the scale isn't there, or things haven't worked out. So our experience is often people are quite heads down. If they're in executive roles currently, they're focused on the job in hand, and sometimes they're coming to the job search a little bit sort of rusty on their network, or haven't really thought through, or I've never had to look for a job before. In 20 years, I've always had, promotions, internal or whatever it is, and suddenly they're coming to the market. So this podcast is really designed to help you if you fall into buckets of like, how do I go get that job? How do I start thinking about it? Particularly if you've been out of this for a little while.
Yeah, I think every week, or maybe every other week, or it feels like we're constantly encountering executives who are finding themselves on the job market and unsure of how to approach this, right? We're seeing, people that have, either been promoted up or, or new executives and have never had to encounter this. Whereas, in the past, maybe they've always applied for roles, and now they're encountering this, kind of reputation-based job search, which is vastly different than it has been for them in the past. And so we get a lot of questions about, how do I approach this? What's the best way to start? What are just some tips or strategies here?
Yeah, there's a different market as well. I mean, I think everything's changed, right? I think, again, if you've had your career over 15, 20, 25 years, something like that, right? Like we've seen the rise of both LinkedIn, the shift in working patterns, the shift in skills in demand is quite pronounced, and it feels like it's still evolving. Particularly as we see AI and money flowing in different directions. There's different requirements that people are putting into their job descriptions that they're looking for this top talent. So I think it's our intention here was very much to give some really digestible, practical tips on how to navigate that market. Jumping into that, Dan, what might be a sort of a top? If we go through a number of sort of the meat of the advice, as it were, what might be a top tip you'd give somebody who's in those shoes of trying to look for their next executive role?
Yeah, a great question. Appreciate that. I think the place I normally tell people to start is simply, build your ecosystem, right? Maybe build an Excel sheet or Google sheet, figure out some way to a holistic mapping of the companies you'd want to work for. Maybe, and you tier them, in different ways based on criteria that's important to you, but build out a full list of, hey, these are the top, these are the 50 companies I'd work for. These are the 20 companies I'd want to work for. And then, just map them out, put them in a list, and then start figuring out, maybe who there. But, I think it's important to make sure that you're systematically working through company by company in your preferred order. One, so you're not forgetting anything, or thinking you reached out to somebody, a certain company, or two, you're making sure you've covered every base you can, and you're thinking about different ways to approach these companies. Is that how you would attack it? Like, what advice do you typically giving?
Yeah, I'm curious about that. So it sounds like researching the sector, researching the company that you're looking at is the tip there, I suppose. And so how would you, I'm curious, Dan, what would you say around the parameters? I mean, sort of taking a step back, how do I even come up with that list, right? Like what are the questions you'd be asking someone if they're saying, like, I'm not sure, where the next job is. This is kind of what I want to do, but like, how do I work out what those companies are that are hot, or where I should be looking?
And there's a number of different ways to look at that. I think, if you're, if they're in your ecosystem or your domain, you typically will have, at least some idea of the best companies, the best performing companies, where all the best talent's going, what companies are working on, maybe the challenges you'd want to be working on, or working on technology you'd want to work with as well, right? So, have some kind of, general idea. Maybe those are your tier one companies because you know them, you admire them, you follow them. Outside of those companies, it's digging into, Google, or, maybe this ChatGPT creates you a list of competitors, or a second tier of those set of companies, maybe companies that are working on adjacent technology, or they're in a similar space, or your skill set applies to them, or you kind of think, well, it'd be great to work there. And I've seen people doing my role at other companies go and work for similar companies, that kind of thing. You could also go through Crunchbase if you have subscription. Look at, especially if you want to work for a startup and you've been in startups. Okay, well, what are the other Series A, Series B, or even seed stage companies doing something similar? Maybe they've raised money and they're getting ready to hire as well. But those are some of the resources you can, use LinkedIn, use Google, use AI, use Crunchbase. What am I forgetting?
I think podcasts as well. As we're on what I think that can also be a good area, right? There's sort of two ways of looking at it, right? One is making sure you've covered all the sort of the directly relevant areas that you're looking at, right? So let's say you're in consumer mobile or something like that, right? There's a way of looking at finding all those players that are out there at the moment, which could be more sort of traditional, looking at analyst reports, things like that, Googling around it, finding those type of magic box type grids where they tell you like who's most innovative, who's the large, fastest growing, etc. So that can be a way of finding some of the targets in a sector you already know. And then I think advice I'd give people would be, if you want to be creative or understand, there are probably a lot of companies out there you just haven't heard of, or might be adjacent to what you're looking at, or coming up the curve in a slightly different way. And a good way of finding those companies, I think, as you mentioned, one is following the money. So you can look at funds that are investing in, whether that's earlier stage, it could be seed VC type funds, venture capital type funds. Follow what they're doing. If it's later stage, it could be private equity. What are the private equity funds that are investing in companies in your space, right? Because they will likely be, looking for top talent. They'll likely be, looking to change management over time if they're making an acquisition. So that can be an element, I think. And then I said, there's some more creative ways of newsletters, podcasts, trying to find out which way the wind is blowing in whatever sector you're in ahead of time, because it might be that there's a whole new category out there that's really ready to go. For example, we've worked with short format media in recent years, right? That's been a big growth category, this idea of stories that are 5-10 minutes long, right, rather than 40 minutes long. And we've seen a number of competitors arise out of that space, or companion AI companion AI apps, for example, something else also we've been working at, right? That's a entirely new category that didn't exist 2 years ago, but when you dig in, you go, wow, this is growing really fast. So you can find those things by, I think, keeping close to some of the newsletters and sort of industry news in these target areas, and picking them out a little bit quicker than or ahead of the game of everyone else.
Absolutely, right? Like, I think building out those resources as part of your ecosystem, or you're part of your learning in the space, is helpful in finding companies you wouldn't otherwise know of, building out your ecosystem of investors, PE or VC or, what have you. And the talent partners as part of that ecosystem is important as well. Getting an introduction to them is important too, as part of the overall ecosystem that you're thinking about building, because there will be jobs within those portfolios that you may not otherwise know about, or companies that are really exciting that you'll never have heard of till the job's filled, or it's too late, right? So if you can get in front of that, that's another way.
And I think also part of that research angle, if you can be narrow, you can go quite deep on companies as well, and understanding, as we do, right? We understand there are certain companies in a site, where are they in their cycle of hiring, and understanding that can help save your time and energy on where you're focusing. So you might say, well, this company, they got acquired 3 years ago, and that was probably at the peak of market, right, for their acquisitions or raised money during pandemic years. Some of them were relying upon predictions about the future, right? Continued pandemic environment. So the valuation's very high. And then 2-3 years later, they're still good businesses, but they haven't grown in quite the same way, or, they hired against certain assumptions which haven't come through. So you can sort of save yourself time by if you dig in and realize, okay, that company is probably not in the mood to really be, leading a lot of like growth orientated talent, if that's what you're looking for, versus, again, you might understand, okay, well, this company, however, they've had a hit product, they're doing extremely well, they are still expanding, where are they expanding to? I mean, at time of recording, a recent example we've been talking about is Duolingo, for example, right? Everyone knows Duolingo, hugely successful consumer mobile app, left everyone else in the dirt. Recently they bought a games team. They acquired a games team out of the UK. It's kind of interesting, right? So if you're looking at that, like, okay, well, this is a sort of a sideways expansion they're making. Being aware of the trends of those companies and seeing like who's in expansion mode, who's not, I think can really help you direct. Another one of our dear clients on the pod is Scopely, for example, right? They're a multi-billion-dollar company that make mobile games, and they've been making billions of dollars out of a game called Monopoly Go. Very, very successful against a market which has been struggling, right? So again, somebody like Scopely is going to be hiring very aggressively in the market. You're getting on their radar, building that, targeting your research so deeper and deeper into that company is going to be more helpful against a company like, so, well, okay, they're going to be looking more at divestments and cuts in the coming years. And unless that's your skill set, right? Unless you're saying like, actually, I'm really looking to do a turnaround type role. I think that can also be part of this research stage. And again, we can sort of go deeper into that, but I think there's sort of desk-based research you can do, but research can also through your network, help you inform and get deeper on that.
Absolutely. I think, networking can be a podcast episode or two all on its own. I think there's a lot of different tactics someone can take there. What would you say is the best approach to articulating your network out as part of this research, right? When would you want to go and leverage your network? When should you, or which maybe who in your network is best to connect with, and maybe at a high level?
That's our second tip, really, isn't it? It's like build the network and interrogate that network that you have. And I think, again, we see it very commonly. People are heads down. Some people are natural networkers, and they've got a very strong, broad network already. They're very sort of externally focused in their role. Some people are not, and that's okay, right? And I think what we'd say to those people is that's not sort of faithful. If you're sort of looking at your network and think, gosh, I've worked at the same company for a long time and I just didn't sort of build any sort of external network. It's something you can do. You can do proactively. It takes a bit of time and a bit of work, but it's certainly not something that you're, behind on necessarily, or you're not something that's ruled out from you as a tool to help you, go and find that next top role. So start again. You can start off by writing it out, getting a sense of like, okay, well, who do I know has moved on to relevant companies I'm interested in? Who's already working at those, in those companies I'd put in my tier 1 list of companies I want to work in? Start reaching out to them. Go grab a coffee or catch up Zoom. Say, hey, I'm thinking about my next move. Get that sort of advice. More proactively, you can think through, if you're doing this over a period of time, you can start to think, okay, well, who do I really want to nurture and maintain as my key contacts? We're going to talk about relationship with headhunters down the line. Those could be key people in your network. It could be other key execs. It could be mentor figures you've had in the past. And thinking, okay, proactively, I want to check in with them every 3-6 months, something like that, to go and get that advice on what's going on in the market. Go and get that external input to your own job search, which is going to help you understand, okay, well, A, what are people looking for? in terms of skill set, and when your profile is hot, and B, what are the kind of companies that they're watching and saying like, wow, these people are really moving the needle. They're doing things that are exciting, and then you can sort of start to target and get onto their radar more, sort of orientate yourself to get onto their radar more. I think people can be surprised about their network. Would you agree with that, Dan? This is sometimes people think they don't have much network, but then they sort of actually really dig in and they start to discover they actually have quite a bit of ex and former colleagues or friends around the network that or the industry they've accrued.
Yeah, I think people would be surprised, especially if you've been heads down for 2, 3, 4 years, really working. And we often encounter people who are surprised with where their people, where their network, where their past peers or bosses are now working, or even where some of their direct reports are working, that maybe they can be a way into a role or be an intro into a company that may have simply just be too big and unaware of who they are already, right? Would you say network is step one? What would be your approach in? I know we'll talk about this more on the second episode, but would you leverage your warm network to get into this, to go for, out, without a role, or would you wait for a role, before you leverage the network?
I think you build up that network and you keep it warm, regardless of role. And that's actually the best time, is to really just have those honest conversations. I think, there can be a hesitancy if somebody's feeling like they're getting approached by someone who's actively looking for a job. There can be a reaction from people saying like, oh, I don't have anything to help you with. And that makes them feel almost like they're going to leave them on a little bit or disappoint them or something like that. It puts a little bit of pressure on the context of the conversation. So reaching out, being friendly, a powerful line can be, I'd love to get your advice on the market. I'm super happy where I am. However, the next, 6 to 12 months, I feel like I'm coming to the end of my project. I feel like I'm ready for a new challenge. So I just really want to understand, what does the market look like? What are you hearing from the market? What are you seeing as the kind of challenges in your org where you think, wow, I'd really love someone to come in and solve these problems, or that's the direction of travel. And those can be powerful conversations. Also recognizing it can be really useful just to hear the negative feedback or the negatives of the industry, right? The sort of like, hey, yeah, this industry is dying, right? Like print media, whatever it is, right? You're saying it's not, whatever secrets it is, it's sort of, okay, boom days may be behind you there. However, this is where all the conversations we're having at the board level are around X, Y, Z. Okay, that's helpful, right? And again, if you know that, then probably like 6 to 12 months down the line, you start seeing those roles being recruited more heavily. You can maybe have got some time ahead of time to position yourself and your expertise or your CV or your own coverage, and internally go run after that project. Put your hand up and say like, hey, I'd love to lead our project on using AI and content creation and marketing strategy, whatever it is, right? Like, I know that's going to be really valuable to the kind of companies I want to go join.
Yeah, I think interacting with your network that at companies you admire or maybe want to, or think you'd want to work at, could also be eye-opening in terms of just understanding more about the culture of these organizations, right? Maybe the structure is, not how you'd want to work, or maybe the decision making is not how you'd like to operate, or maybe they don't give as much autonomy, or maybe they give too much autonomy. Understanding the culture is incredibly important, especially the executive level, right? Aligning to the culture, aligning to the executive team, aligning towards, how decisions are made, and seeing yourself in that role for the next 4 years is incredibly important. So just getting an insider look or view, culture, is incredibly important, and may save you countless hours of having gone through an interview process only to realize that at the end, right, when you go through the executive panel case study, right, is important, and will save them and you potentially a lot of time.
Just pick up, because I think it's such an interesting point you make around culture, because again, it saves time. It also empowers you if you get approached, if you're getting headhunted about a role by by a company. It really helps you sort of say, look, well, I've heard this about the culture. I don't like working in that culture. And they might give you the opportunity. They might turn around and say like, well, actually, that's exactly why we want somebody like you, right? And we've seen that in candidates who've got jobs. They're coming in to help them make a transition away from being 2X or 2Y to bring in. Or you can have an honest conversation and they say, yeah, actually, you know what? The CEO isn't ready to let go of the reins. They still want to maintain a lot of control. That's a fair point. That's how they run it. And if you don't like that, then you're saving everyone's time by saying that's not for you. So you're saving your own time, and I think that's showing, also demonstrating how I think you can come across quite as impressively as a candidate. Again, to to a recruiter or to a headhunter, if you can say to them, hey, I know this company and I've got insights and I've got wisdom on that, you can really set yourself up as ahead of the other candidates in your market by showing that sort of external awareness as well, which might make, mean you're more likely to get up that queue, as it were, for the next job, or make it even more personal to that person you're talking to about, like, well, what is the right role? When do I pick up the phone to you? Because a lot of executive hiring is around timing. I think so much was around timing that, you're actually helping in an indirect way. Understanding culture helps you get better roles through timing. And to just give one clear example, the example I always think about when I think about culture is often Google and Amazon. You interview many executives over the decades from both those organizations, and both have excellent, high-performing organizations. But Amazon way, very, very process-driven, very structured in their thinking to a degree, whereas as Google tend to attract some very creative type candidates. Again, not to say people from Amazon can't be creative at all, but the approach, the free flowing, the types of even degrees that these people often did at university, they're often just very different, right? In the way that they act, the way they deal with responsibility, the way they think and task solve. And it's it's not quite oil and water, but I think those are two good examples of very high performing, successful cultures. We get great individuals with both, but probably one you'd say it's not easy to go from one to the other. And you don't see as much transition between those two companies because there's such a culture, a strong sense of culture that's kind of different or suit different people.
Absolutely. And how would you say kind of personal brand, in addition to kind of understanding skill set maybe, as well as, how would you say those things are important to think about in the early days? How important is, how you're, maybe presenting yourself to the market, in those early days, or to your network in terms of how you're approaching a specific role? I think like what's important here in terms of brand and skill set?
Yeah, I think that there's sort of different layers to what do we mean by personal brand. One layer we would definitely say is helpful and critical is that sort of reputation in the market from referencing. So again, if you're really looking to make those moves that we talked about in previous episodes, those moves to those very top jobs, one of the things that's going to come through is who's been following you around. How do people see you as a leader? How have you grown people? How do your peer group respond to you being on a project or, being in charge, right? So, really nurturing the people around you. And, sorry to say it, but I think some people get stuck a little bit who maybe have been very sort of self-focused in their own career, right? Like the people who, the very top executives are highly collaborative people, might not surprise you, majority of them are, and very good at getting a lot of buy-in from other people, particularly if they change roles. If you're just building an empire in one org, maybe you're less required to do that. But if you're searching for executive roles externally, having that personal brand in terms of just the referencing and who are the great examples and people you can show you developed and or peers who've really would say the most wonderful things about you is really important. The other side of personal brand I think people can think of is sort of name recognition on a more public setting. So, some elements of that could be going to conferences, building up, talking at conferences, being proactive on social media channels, particularly LinkedIn as the professional one, or again, I think X is another big one for some industries, and acquiring that sort of that thought leadership. It can be helpful. I think it certainly can be helpful to that. And if you can, particularly if somebody's looking for that in the role, I mean, it's almost a skill set there. It's almost like we're looking for that person who's going to go out and, let's say it's a senior level role and it's hiring is going to be a large part of that role. Somebody who's very comfortable being externally focused, somebody who an interviewer is already saying, oh, I've seen their talk. I was really impressed what they had to say about their integration at AWS or something like that, right? You can say, wow, that's going to help with name recognition, like any brand, if they've already heard that. So I think it can be helpful. It's not as critical as the first bit. So again, if you're somebody who's not an extrovert, again, don't despair or feel like that's all the top execs are necessarily doing this. They're not necessarily doing it. You can be extremely effective and really shine in the work you've done through that first bit of personal brand. But if you're curious about the next bit, I think that can be really important. I think we can go into that more in the next podcast about how you do that, because I think there's a right way and a wrong way to do that. You can you can have a negative personal brand, right? Like having a personal brand is a neutral comment. So being careful about how you do that and how you select that, I think can be sensible as part of your prep work.
I just wanted to add to that as well. I think personal brand matters, mostly at the C-level, in my opinion. I think it gives, a potential board, a CEO, someone hiring you into a CTO, CPO role, a view into, how you communicate, what you say, maybe potentially how you, kind of inspire an audience, or how you're thinking about certain technology, or maybe instead of inspire, maybe have you like, hone an audience, right? And gives a view into maybe how you would be a culture builder or a team builder, what level of talent you could attract to your organization as well. I think just being a thought leader is important, many different roles. Not to say you have to be, this kind of like content person externally, but I think it does help. Giving presentations or speaking at certain, places as well is important. Not a requirement, but I think it helps for certain roles, for certain teams, for certain boards and CEOs that are looking for, this kind of person on their team. So I think brand building is important. Maybe at the VP level, not as much because you're not necessarily focused at that, but maybe someone ascending to the role or a sitting C-suite executive, that can be important for specific roles.
I think that's just a great point that particularly with listed companies, CEO role, that is a very public facing role, right? So again, if you're really orientated towards that, a board will be looking at that ability to be in the spotlight, to communicate externally, at the stakeholder meeting, shareholder meetings, etc. You're going to be carrying a lot of that, and often somewhat taken away from some of the day-to-day running, right? Or you can have deputies and lieutenants who are going to be doing a lot of the day-to-day running, because a lot of your time will be taken up with managing the market perception, communication to the market, etc. So I think that's a good point. So it will vary on certain roles, and particularly if you're going for CEO jobs really at the top of listed companies, or C-level jobs at the top of listed companies, that is increasingly going to be a important part. The personal brand will be impactful when boards are looking at, who are they bringing in, because also they're under the spotlight, right? Making it easier to hire someone who's got a great reputation, everyone knows. If they hire someone that doesn't have a big personal brand, then they might feel that's more risky, right? And again, it's the same candidate, might be the same skill set, right? It might be even better candidate, but there is, sadly, I think everyone knows this, but we'll say it out loud, right? It's not a secret, but there's risk mitigation in hiring. It's not always, the hiring decision is not always about, purely objective, this is definitively the best person to do a role. There's also an element of risk in taking someone on personally, right? And if they take somebody whose CV isn't as shiny or is not an obvious choice, then the hiring manager is taking a lot more risk around their decision, versus if you take someone with the CV or the brand that looks very, very comfortable and very risk-free. If they don't work out, that's more the candidate's fault rather than your fault. Whereas if you take somebody who looks a bit risky and they don't work out, well, then that's sort of on you. So I think that can be also an element to call it out. It's a reality there. So you might as well sort of get comfortable with that and think about, okay, how do I position myself to be in a good place in that race?
How should someone be thinking about their skill set as it applies to jobs that they're interested in? I think, if you're building out the list of companies you're really interested in, how can someone be, maybe more aware of what roles they fit into, or what companies they might fit into, and save themselves time? Because I think a job search can be a full-time job on its own. It can take hundreds of hours, months, long for time, right? And being able to focus on, what's most relevant is incredibly important to saving time, or maybe shortening timeline, to that. Obviously, you have to wait for the right role, but how can someone maybe best understand their skill set, or how can someone be aware of what they're bringing?
I think that question is coming up a lot again in recent years, just because of a lot of churn and change in the market. And I think it goes, sort of tip number 3 is sort of understanding your skill set against, the role you want, and then its availability in the market. And it builds on the first 2 tips around sort of understanding the market, because number 1 is, I'd say, have a real deep think about what do you want to do that's going to be meaningful for you in the next 5 years. If you're not doing what you're currently doing, what would be really sort of tipping the scales, be personally fulfilling for whatever reasons, right, against whatever objective. So have an articulation of that. I think often when we ask candidates that, they pause and say, that's a great question. And then they're almost like they're thinking about it, probably not for the first time, but maybe they haven't sort of intentionally thought about the answer to that question. So I think that can give you a lot of guidance on that. Then it's sort of understanding, how does what you've done thus far really match up with the role that you want? And again, I think being pretty honest with yourself around the market, around what you can really demonstrate, and whether that actually, I think if you can really take a step back and really say, well, would that be impressive to the hiring manager that I'm trying to impress with what I've done to date? And if the answer is, the cold live day is like not really, or like that's a bit of a stretch, or I haven't really got all those bits, then that's going to be a challenge, right? So I think you still have to be thinking about, maybe there's more of a hybrid type role that I have to go to, or a stepping stone to get to that. Maybe it's internally where you are, as I've said earlier. Maybe you go and get some more of that exposure. Maybe you have to take more risk yourself by going to proposition maybe where they don't have as much tier one talent applying to them. So you feel like you can go get the experience, but you might be aware that there's more risk in the enterprise or the growth or the success of it, and be comfortable with that because you're doing it to get the experience that you want, or the the relevancy. And then also I think, be clear-eyed about, well, how much demand is there for the role you want to do, or your profile. And I think sadly, I saw somebody at a conference the other week, they said, I do this and I've been doing it for like 15, 20 years. I'm not sure people really need what I've been doing for that long. I think the market sort of shifted. I had to agree with them. And I thought, but it was a healthy conversation, because I think they're saving themselves a bit of pain and refreshing themselves to think some more actively about something else, right? And so being quite clear-eyed about really how big is the market I'm aiming at? Any more than if you were launching a product, you'd think about, how big is the market, right? And how much do I fit that? I think also sort of thinking about the size of so the market for your profile, and having a view on that. And if it's not hot, then sort of thinking, okay, well, how do I reposition, or how do I then you can have some tangible actions once you know that. Versus, I think some people are running at the market again and again and again, and they're sort of saying, it's weird, I've never struggled to find a job before. Like never. And 25 years of successfully finding jobs, right? And they're still like very highly qualified, smart people who've got a lot of capabilities. But then they're sort of running into a brick wall, though, because they haven't realized that actually that the market's changed, and that's tough. But we can't sort of get around it. That sometimes you've got to like look at that, and then once you realize that, you can then take more actions.
I think understanding the skill set you have, if it's still relevant. I think one question we often get, or I think I hear about a lot, is, can I go work for a startup, or should I go work for a startup, right? And often it's someone who has only been at scale, for most of their career, or for the last 15 years or something else, or they were at Google, Amazon, Meta, or they were at EA, Roblox or something. And it's like, okay, well, if you weren't early stage at these companies, it's going to be a big challenge for you to come in and now and go, to a new to a brand new studio, or to a brand new startup that's Series A, or, they raised an A round or a B round even, right? Or even C round in a lot of cases, because, the challenges that you face or you've accomplished in these larger scale companies aren't going to be the same challenges. So they're often looking for someone that has, seen this growth stage, or this, this early stage, or can be tactical, today. Like if you've been a manager of managers for, many years, the chances of, you getting hired for this, high execution, a hybrid role, it will be more challenging, as well. I think companies are trying to solve this very specific challenge or need today, and they're looking for someone who's solved that recently. And I think candidates can see a company as being very appealing, but there's, the skill set just doesn't match, or it matched 10 years ago, whereas it doesn't match today. And you have to find that a very specific fit.
There might be people listening to pod saying, but no, I could do that, right? And I could understand.
Yeah.
Some people, I think, feel quite frustrated because they sort of say, look, no, I can do that. I know I can do this role, right? And they're running against it. And I probably just want to say to them, again, the sort of the practical, clear-eyed advice is companies can often be very risk adverse in their hiring in ways that they might not feel to them. They might be sort of a high risk company, right? Or they see themselves as taking a lot of risks, or building something very sort of future. But often it really boils down to candidates. They want candidates who have solved the challenges that they're facing in front of them in some way or form. And if it's sort of building something from the ground up with no brand, that's what they want. And some people say, well, I built up the Berlin office or the New York office for that company of 0 people to 100 people. And they don't necessarily say, well, I've done that. But they might, from the other side, I found about saying, no, but you did that as part of a larger org, right? Where the cash was coming down, the brand was there, you weren't quite on the line for your mortgage and your family, all the rest, if this isn't successful. So I think, that can just, again, save you some pain you're going and doing it yourself can be one way of really showing people, because once you've done it once, people then go, oh, of course you can do it, right? Like clearly there might be lots of people who I'd say you probably can go do that job, but the reality is hiring managers of those jobs, often those that be founder CEOs in those examples, they will tend away often from a risk or perceived inability to operate where they are, which is not entirely unreasonable as well. But I think that's one point. And also on the other side of that, again, we work with a lot of companies with thousands and thousands of employees. At the upper end of management, often again is a barrier, is they just want a certain scale of management before. So they might be saying, look, you need to have run teams of 200 people plus, right, to go get this job. And we're not going to look at you and done anything under 100 people historically. And again, I see that sometimes a frustration of people saying, well, I'm a great, people manager. Is there really that much difference between my team of 80 and 200, right? And the reality is that there is. I think there is a difference. These roles get more political. They get more about sort of managing people, right? And sort of setting up the whole structures. So again, sort of understanding, it goes back to that, right? Like understanding your skill set versus like what people are really looking for at both ends of the spectrum, whether you're going to a bigger company or a smaller company or whatever it is, you're finding that way of articulating the story or getting that experience that's going to put you in that role if it's really what you want, if you want to make that transition.
Yeah, I like that point around kind of the risk a company is taking on, right? Whereas it's early stage, maybe they have a specific burn rate and they need to hit a milestone or a metric within a year, right? Or they're worried about some competitors coming in, or if it's at scale, they can't necessarily, make the wrong hire because this is a 200 person org and they also have a metric they need to hit, or they're also concerned about what the board is going to say, if they get this wrong, right, as well, or they have a specific talent bar they're trying to meet that's achieved. It was very specific things throughout their career, and that's how they have to hire against, because there's a set and finite criteria as well. I think we could talk about this for a long time, but maybe best for the sake of keeping this podcast short or short-ish, to kind of talk bite size, right? Exactly. Maybe do you want to highlight some common blockers or maybe some common challenges that a great candidate may be seeing or maybe should be aware of in the market as to why they're not getting the job in general?
I think sometimes it can just be, again, the timing of the market, the cycle of the market. An easy one for examples of this is in marketing searches, where you sometimes they want brand marketing. At the moment, I think performance marketing is really in vogue, right? And they can oscillate between the two there. So I think some understanding the timing of the market can be a really helpful one of where your skill set fits into that. But I think otherwise, again, sort of covering those, just awareness of the market and really sort of seeing very clearly how they could be perceived. So more philosophically, I think something we all struggle with, Dan, is the ability to see ourselves from the outside perspective, right? That's a really tough skill to manage. If you are struggling in your job search, I would say try and get a hold of that. And, again, or get somebody who can give you that very honest feedback. And again, getting honest feedback is tough. I'm going to talk about that next week, because I think people want to give nice feedback or general feedback. They want to avoid conflict. So if you can do that, though, I think that will help unlock whatever it is that's blocking you if you are trying to make a move and start to solve that problem.
The market is important to understand and not necessarily a reflection of a company's desire to hire you, which is potentially not an open role. I think there's fewer roles at the executive level, right? So giving yourself enough time, find those roles. It takes a good market 6 months to find a role. So, you may have to wait for something. You may have to be open to travel. You may have to be open to relocation or even an office, as we're seeing more of this stuff come back. So having some flexibility on office setup or the kind of, travel setup is important as well. I think typically the most common blockers is fewer, depending on the market you're in. I think we've seen for consumer tech, it's been a slow market. I think we've seen for games, it's been a hot market in some, locations and slower, in others. And within organizations, obviously, some hiring and some going through layoffs continued as well. So just being aware of that. There's many great candidates that are, I think, still looking for roles and just trying to find that fit. But sometimes there are external factors that you just may not be aware of, as to why you're not getting those, or you should be aware of.
No, I think that's right. And I mean, taking the point there, Dan, he says it can be a 6-month timeline. I mean, just as I'm thinking about it, in some ways, if you're really progressing, depending on where listeners are on their career journey. If you're really progressing for those top, we're focused on executive level searches here, and as top C-level or VP level roles. Sometimes these are culminations of a decade, right? of directional trajectory. And again, sometimes the market is changing within that. So you've got to stay agile, you've got to stay adaptive within the market. So 6 months is easy to sort of say, look, you're finding the right role. Again, it could happen tomorrow. The right thing comes up at the right time. Sometimes there's a great fit with the company, a great fit with X, Y, Z, but the role doesn't materialize for 18, 24 months, right? And keeping that relationship there so that you're the first person in mind when that role comes up, you're already a familiar sort of name and idea that somebody they'd want to hire if they could. Again, can be the case. And we see that with candidates we know over sometimes 3-4 years, right? Before the right role at the right time comes up when they want to move and the right kind of matches on the other side. So timelines can be really long in this game, and having a sort of a long set mentality, I think there's a better way of saying that, a long-term mentality can but a strategic mindset can put you ahead.
That really highlights the importance of networking, and not just when you're looking for a role, but throughout, consistently staying in touch, or just meeting people that you'd want to work for, or getting to know investors and just staying on the radar. And it doesn't have to be because you're looking for a role today. Just means you're staying close and you're waiting for something opportunistic as well. I think that again highlights the importance of of networking and keeping your connections warm. And staying close, and I think we'll talk about that extensively on the next episode as well.
If you can marry the sort of the awareness of your profile with the relevancy of your profile, right? You have to have both those things working together, then you can get some really, really exciting opportunities coming your way. So to summarize here, Dan, then, so we've had key tips I heard were do your research. Dan, I think that's your first tip around sort of the sector, the company, who's hiring, who's hot, who's not, where's your profile going to be exciting, or what's the profile these kind of companies going to be looking for in 6 months' time, or who are the companies that are not on your radar. So sort of tip one is building that research. Tip two was building the network. You were just talking about it just then again, Dan, about keeping it warm, building it outside of when you directly need it. So it's a bit like investing, right? The best time to start investing was 10 years ago, and second best time is now, right? I think the same as network. So, today, start building that out, start understanding the market better, and what people are looking for, and who can be your friend in the market. Tip three was understanding that sort of skill set that you have versus the role you want. How much of an overlap is what the role you want versus what you've done today, and how in demand is that role, right? Like how many are there actually out there? Of these kind of roles. And then, we've talked a little bit about timeline as well. That it's a long-term strategic goal here if you really want to go for those top positions. And you can see the arcs of the top CEOs, they've worked very consistently with a goal in mind for sometimes decades, of climbing, to the very top, the pinnacle of the corporate ladder. Dan, any final thoughts or anything else you'd say to our listeners?
No, I mean, I'd simply say, thanks everyone for watching or listening. We covered a lot of different, topics here, but if you have any other questions, you can always find us on LinkedIn through a message there, or through our website, or, through an email if you have it. But thanks again for tuning in, and we'll look forward to sharing more tips next week when we cover more of this. Yeah, absolutely. Next week, we're going to be covering the application of the prep work. So you've done the prep work. What do you do next? How do you approach that job search? So we'll be digging into some themes there. But we'll look forward to seeing you again. Thanks, everyone. Take care, everyone. That's another episode of Mission 1, The Executive Edge. If you found this valuable, hit subscribe and leave us a review. It helps other professionals discover the show. Have a question about executive hiring or want to share your own experience? Reach out on LinkedIn or visit mission1.io/podcast. We read everything, and your stories often inspire future episodes. The Executive Edge is brought to you by Mission 1, where we specialize in placing senior leaders at tech, entertainment, and AI companies. Learn more at mission1.io. Thanks for listening, and we hope to see you again soon on The Executive Edge.